Good
done,
girl,
Noella.
good girl. You can be free. This is your
free.
home. You go ahead, sweet girl.
Oh, look at her go.
That's a girl. Well done, babe.
She was born under the spotlight, cradled not in silk, but in the arms of crocodiles and koalas. To the world, Bindi Irwin is the wildlife princess, the heir to Australia's most beloved conservation dynasty. But behind the radiant smile and the khaki uniform lies a truth far more complicated. What if the battle to protect her father's legacy came with a hidden cost, one that fractured the very heart of her family? For years, the Irwins projected an image of unbreakable unity, rising from the tragedy of Steve Irwin's death stronger than ever. But rumors have long swirled beneath the surface of tension, silence, and a mother-daughter relationship that's more fragile than fans would like to believe. Whispers began to grow louder when Bindi made headlines for publicly omitting her grandfather, Bob Irwin, from a heartfelt tribute. But what truly raised eyebrows wasn't just that omission. It was how Terri Irwin, Bindi's own mother, stood quietly behind that decision, fueling speculation that this wasn't just about a grandfather, but about control, legacy, and a family divided from within. Some insiders claim that Terri's grip on the Australia Zoo empire became suffocating, casting a shadow over her daughter's adulthood. Others argue Bindi, now a mother herself, is desperately trying to carve out her own voice, while still being haunted by the weight of her father's legend. Between whispered power struggles and carefully curated interviews, one question echoes louder than the rest. Is Bindi Irwin truly free to be herself, or is she living a script written by her mother? Bindi Irwin was born on July 24, 1998, into a world unlike any other. Her parents, Steve and Terri Irwin, weren't just wildlife conservationists. They were Australia's most iconic couple, the faces of Australia Zoo and the stars of The Crocodile Hunter, a global phenomenon. Bindi's infancy was documented beside pythons, wombats, and crocodiles. By the time she could walk, she was already a public figure. And when tragedy struck in 2006, the shocking death of Steve Irwin from a stingray injury while filming, Bindi, at just 8 years old, stood on stage in front of millions, delivering a eulogy that brought the world to tears. A child had just become the symbolic torchbearer of her father's empire. In the years that followed, Terri Irwin worked tirelessly to protect Steve's legacy. She expanded Australia Zoo, secured television deals, and guided her daughter through the world of media and conservation with a strict sense of purpose. Bindi, in turn, seemed to embrace it all, hosting wildlife shows, speaking at environmental events, even winning Dancing with the Stars in the US in 2015. Her image was pristine, her message consistent, honoring her father's dream, continuing the family mission. But quietly, a new narrative was forming. Observers began to notice just how carefully managed Bindi's public appearances were. Every statement about Steve was glowing. Every interview seemed to orbit around the past, never the future. Terri, often just off camera or in frame, remained a dominant figure. There were few mentions of Bindi's personal struggles, few signs of divergence from the family line. Some began to wonder, was Bindi choosing this path, or was it chosen for her? Then came a more visible crack. In June 2021, Bindi posted a Father's Day tribute praising her late dad and others, but pointedly excluded her grandfather, Bob Irwin. When questioned, she responded with a statement that stunned the public. She accused Bob of psychological abuse and of never spending time with her growing up. It wasn't just the words that struck people. It was the timing, the finality, and the eerie absence of any mention of her mother's role in that family fracture. Many began to dig deeper, and patterns emerged. Former zoo staff and insiders hinted at long-standing disagreements between Terri and Bob Irwin after Steve's death, particularly around the zoo's commercialization and management. Bob quietly retreated from public life, while Terri tightened control over the Irwin brand. And Bindi, caught between reverence for her father and loyalty to her mother, had no space to tell her own story. This video will unravel that tension. The slow-burning friction between a daughter raised as a symbol and a mother determined to preserve a legacy. It's a story of silent sacrifices, power hidden beneath smiles, and a legacy that may have cost more than the world ever imagined. From the outside, Bindi Irwin's ascent looked almost magical, a seamless transition from grieving daughter to global wildlife ambassador. At just 9 years old, she launched Bindi the Jungle Girl, a television series where she danced, smiled, and educated children about animals with astonishing poise. The world watched in awe. Here was a child who had just lost her father, not crumbling, but blooming. She quickly won awards, released fitness DVDs, wrote books, and became a public face, not just for conservation, but for resilience. Behind the curtain, though, the pace was relentless. Bindi's schedule was packed. She was giving interviews, rehearsing, filming, attending galas, all while still a child. And always at the center of every spotlight was Steve's memory. She was expected to carry it, celebrate it, embody it. Terri Irwin in interviews often described her daughter as a miracle, and many noted how closely she managed Bindi's career. Every project aligned with the Irwin brand. Every step Bindi took was within the framework her mother built. Then came Chandler Powell, an American wakeboarder who entered Bindi's life in 2013. Their romance was sweet and modest at first, but it represented something new, a choice Bindi had made entirely on her own. As the relationship deepened, so did her yearning for personal independence. She began speaking more confidently in interviews, subtly shifting her public image. While she still honored her father, she was no longer just the little girl in khaki. She was a young woman carving a path. But friction began to show. There were quiet reshufflings at Australia Zoo. Longtime staff left without explanation. Rumors circulated in Sunshine Coast circles of growing differences between Terri and the rest of the Irwin family. Bindi was no longer a child, yet Terri reportedly maintained strong oversight of her decisions. Insiders whispered that Chandler's presence introduced discomfort, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented: autonomy. When Bindi and Chandler married in March 2020, just as the pandemic hit, it was a small, private ceremony at Australia Zoo. Officially, it was intimate due to COVID restrictions. Unofficially, some noticed key absences, notably Bob Irwin, Bindi's grandfather. The rift was now impossible to hide. Then, in June 2021, everything shifted. Bindi's explosive social media post came seemingly out of nowhere. She accused Bob of being emotionally distant, of ignoring her throughout her life, and of causing pain to her family for years. The tone was final. The timing, on Father's Day, was deliberate. But what struck many observers was what lay beneath the words: a defense of her mother. She framed Terri as the protector, the one shielding her from hurt. But to some, this felt rehearsed, like a family narrative finally being forced into the open. Bob Irwin's biographer, Amanda French, publicly refuted Bindi's claims, describing Bob as devastated and confused. She stated he had never wanted the spotlight and had simply stepped back to avoid conflict. This conflicting testimony shattered the neat family myth. Who was telling the truth? And what had Bindi been living through all these years? As public opinion swirled, old interviews resurfaced. Bindi as a teenager, nervously repeating lines about continuing Dad's mission. Terri, always just off to the side, steering the message. The cracks that had long been whispered about were suddenly glaring. What began as a story of legacy was turning into one of control, silence, and the cost of loyalty. The revelation of Bindi's post in 2021 was more than just a family matter. It was the collapse of a long-maintained image. For over a decade, the Irwins had been seen as the perfect grieving family, united in honoring Steve's dream. But Bindi's public denouncement of her grandfather shattered that illusion. What followed was not just media speculation, but an emotional awakening for those who had watched her grow up. Perhaps this wildlife princess had been quietly living in a cage all along. Amanda French, the biographer closest to Bob Irwin, responded with genuine sorrow. She described Bob as heartbroken by Bindi's claims, noting he had always tried to stay out of the media circus after Steve's death. He didn't want to be in the spotlight, she said. He didn't want conflict. He just wanted peace. Bob Irwin, now elderly and living quietly in Kingaroy, had not responded publicly for years. And yet now he was thrust into a narrative he could neither control nor defend against. For many, this raised a painful question. Had the Irwin legacy been built not just on love, but on erasure? The emotional toll extended beyond Bob. Former Australia Zoo staff came forward anonymously, sharing that over the years, Terri's leadership had become corporate and controlling, turning a once intimate conservation effort into a branded empire. Some described Bindi as sweet but guarded, always performing, rarely allowed to be herself unless cameras were off. One former staffer stated she was told what to say from a young age. Everything was about preserving Steve's image. Even her grief was scripted. Even more quietly discussed was the strain between Bindi and Terri. While Terri publicly praised her daughter as strong and wise beyond her years, those close to the family hinted at emotional distance. Decisions were often unilateral. Financial control, media appearances, branding, all reportedly overseen by Terri. Chandler's arrival disrupted this dynamic. Some insiders believed he gave Bindi the courage to speak up, not just to the public, but within the family. When Bindi gave birth to her daughter Grace in 2021, it should have been a moment of pure joy. Instead, it became a focal point of tension. While Terri was present and joyful in photos, there was something striking in the way Bindi framed the event. In her posts, she referred to Steve constantly, but not once did she mention Terri as mum or grandma. The tributes were carefully worded, the omissions louder than words. The media, once hesitant to question the Irwin family, began to probe. Editorials appeared asking whether Bindi had ever been allowed to be her own person. Australian tabloids floated theories of inheritance struggles, emotional manipulation, and even legal disputes over the Australia Zoo Trust, though none were confirmed. But the tone had shifted. No longer was this the story of a heroic family rising from loss. It had become a case study in generational pressure, emotional inheritance, and the silent pain of being trapped in a legacy you didn't choose. For fans, the heartbreak was profound. Bindi Irwin, who had once stood so bravely at her father's memorial, was now seen through different eyes, not as a child carrying a torch, but as a woman burdened by a flame she couldn't extinguish. And behind her, always just a step away, was Terri, the protector, the manager, the architect of a life so public, it left little room for the private self. There are few stories as layered and quietly devastating as that of Bindi Irwin. To the public, she remains a symbol of courage. The little girl who stood tall at her father's funeral, who grew up speaking for animals and smiling through unimaginable loss. But beneath that image lies a far more complicated truth, that of a daughter raised not only in the shadow of a father's legend, but also under the weight of a mother's control. From the perspective of Aussie Uncovered, Bindi Irwin is both a product and a prisoner of legacy. Her life, meticulously curated since childhood, was never entirely hers. Every word she spoke to the press, every tribute to her father, every television segment was another stitch in a narrative woven tightly by her family, particularly her mother, Terri. And while that story captivated the world, it left little space for Bindi to grow, stumble, rebel, or redefine herself. The normal rites of passage for any young adult. This is not to deny the sincerity of Terri Irwin's devotion. As a widow and mother, she carried the unbearable task of preserving Steve's memory in a world hungry for heroes. She fought for Australia Zoo, raised her children, and kept the spotlight burning when others might have disappeared into grief. But in doing so, did she unintentionally eclipse her daughter's voice? Bindi's public fallout with Bob Irwin wasn't just about a grandfather's absence, it was a rupture in the Irwin mythology. Her words, sharp and conclusive, seemed to echo something deeper: frustration, exhaustion, and the need to finally say something that wasn't pre-approved. It was perhaps the first real glimpse of Bindi the woman, not Bindi the brand. And in that moment, the audience was split. Some defended her candor, others mourned the perceived cruelty. But one thing became clear: she was no longer playing a role. There is a haunting irony in Bindi's journey. Her father, who embodied freedom and wildness, left behind a legacy so powerful that it became its own kind of captivity. Bindi was never allowed to wander far from that path. Even now, as a mother, a wife, and a public figure in her own right, she is still answering questions not about who she is, but about who her father was. This channel believes Bindi Irwin deserves more than that. She deserves the right to make mistakes, to challenge the narrative, and to be remembered for her own merits. Not just as Steve Irwin's daughter, not just as Terri Irwin's protege, but as a woman who survived the weight of myth and still found the strength to speak. What about you? When you look at Bindi, smiling for the cameras, cradling her daughter, speaking of legacy, do you see someone fulfilled, or someone still trying to escape a story written before she could hold a pen? In the quiet hours when the zoo gates close and the cameras stop rolling, one wonders what Bindi Irwin sees when she looks in the mirror. Is it the child who once walked among crocodiles and TV crews, the daughter who held a nation's grief on her tiny shoulders? Or is it something else, someone else, emerging slowly from the silhouette of a legacy that never quite fit? There's a profound melancholy in watching someone grow up under the weight of a legend. Steve Irwin wasn't just a father, he was a national treasure, a mythic figure whose death froze his image in time. And Bindi, barely old enough to understand loss, became the vessel through which the world continued to love him. But love, even in its purest form, can be suffocating when it demands perfection, silence, and obedience. Now, as a mother herself, Bindi stands at a fragile crossroads. Her daughter Grace will never meet the grandfather whose shadow has shaped their family's story. But perhaps that's where a new story begins, one not written by grief or duty, but by choice. If Bindi dares to let go of the carefully controlled script, if she chooses to step away from the spotlight of nostalgia and into her own sun, she may find something even greater than legacy: freedom. Some stories are never told, but now you know. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of it all. Not the headlines, not the rumors, but the quiet truth that the most famous wildlife family in Australia may never have been as wild or as free as we were led to believe. Because sometimes the cages we grow up in are invisible, and they are built not of iron or steel, but of memory, expectation, and love.